Listen, I didn't want to dwell on Sinnoh for too long, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't have way too much to say on these remakes from both a design perspective and my thoughts as an overall fan of the series. Last video was all about who was making what, and a lot of you guys seem to like that. So stick around to hear what's working and what isn't in Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Now, before any of you guys mention Legends Arceus, that deserves its own video. We're looking at two separate products here, and I want to judge them based on their own merits. So go do all the usual YouTuber subscription stuff if you're interested in seeing what I have to say for those as well. Don't know when that video will be coming out, but it's next on the list for sure. Also want to start off by saying that I'm aware that these games are still super early on, and what my thoughts are might not reflect the final product. Don't think that I'm still passing judgment on something that has 8 months left in the oven. I have a huge back catalogue of videos that are mostly super positive about the series, so if this one is a little cautious or overly negative, I wouldn't want you guys to get turned off over it. Diamond and Pearl remakes have always been on a pretty weird scale for me as far as how badly I've wanted them. On one hand, they're the first games I ever played in the series, and naturally I'm going to have a huge attachment to them either way. Despite that, I also think that from Game Freak's perspective, they have very little reason to remake it outside of giving fans what they want. Which to me is never really a great reason so long as that's the sole reason in the first place. See, previous remakes in the series were fit for a specific purpose that Game Freak were really adamant on as their primary goal. Pokemania's starting to die out? Remake Kanto and push the same game onto a newer generation. Can't get the Gen 2 Pokemon easily in the most recent games? Remake Johto and now you've got an all-star collection of games right there on the modern hardware as a bonus. Got too many ideas for X and Y after the push to 3D? Remake an existing game in Hoenn that lines up with the audience that played those games as kids. Just played a part in releasing one of the biggest games in history? Drop a remake to coincide with it and bring that new audience into the main series. Ideally being one that has the most groundwork laid out so it can be done as quickly as possible. It doesn't matter whether you agree with how they handle their remakes or not, but these openly stated reasons are why we got each and every one of them. From my point of view, Diamond and Pearl are the games that absolutely deserve remakes given the state that they were released in to begin with. They were rushed out the gate and super unfinished due to noticeable flaws in the final product that needed Platinum to be improved upon. They ran on an engine that clearly wasn't optimized at the time, especially given the new information of a prototype build dated just months before release that lacked much of the game's content. They've got design inconsistencies that newer games in the series have since obliterated, like HMs, running shoes, a lack of character customization, random encounters, and route designs like this. Its reasons for existing feel so obvious, so naturally I'm going to be pretty upset when the Sinnoh remake that we're getting seems to have an emphasis on none of those things. In fact, they seem to be putting heavy emphasis on how faithful these seemingly one-to-one remakes are to the originals, and I can't say with certainty that it's going to pay off for all the reasons that I've already mentioned. Nobody liked Sinnoh because the routes were blocky, or the lack of fire types, or the chibi abstraction of an art style that gave it soul, or whatever buzzword you want to use. No, people liked Sinnoh because of all the shit it brought to the table in terms of lore, character designs, and mechanics, and I'm at least glad that the bare minimum is about respecting that when it comes to the remake. What I'm not a huge fan of is the idea that Sinnoh was perfect the way it was, because it wasn't. And that's coming from a guy who has had Platinum in his top 3 since 2009. I get it, Sinnoh has its lake theme, Cynthia, Luxray, and so on. Don't fuck with it and nobody gets hurt. But see, that approach makes it real hard to justify the existence of a BDSP when it's lacking the SOUL behind the originals. A couple of years ago, I made a video on the Let's Go games for being a microcosm of this design philosophy, where they changed all the shit around it, but the parts of Kanto itself that were less than ideal. The way how these remakes come off almost like an idealized stranglehold over the originals just rubs me the wrong way. Because much like Kanto, Sinnoh had its issues too. Now don't think that I'm super against these games, because Diamond and Pearl are still okay in the grand scheme of things. They're not exactly bad, and if these games played exactly like the originals, then they'll still just be fine. Though in the context of a remake that should offer more than the original, I'd be hard pressed to find a reason to pay full price for a game that I already own. One thing a lot of people are going to say is, well, they were never really remaking Platinum, so don't expect the Battlefront here. Hey, shut up. Let me get to that. Wanting more things like fire types or improving Cyrus's motives are just things that I'd expect from any normal Pokemon remake, and it's hardly unreasonable. I really would love to be proved wrong, but seeing a Porygon Z or a Great Sadia Girl in the trailer doesn't imply anything from Platinum is being carried over. We've got NPC placements that are already slightly different, and I'd take the lack of snow on routes or extra Platinum details as evidence that we're not getting stuff from that game anytime soon. With all that in mind, what reason would you have to play this overly faithful version of the game that almost everyone would agree is instantly outdated from launch? All of that being said, ICLA's biggest competition isn't even Game Freak's own offerings from 2008. Historically, the cases for emulation place it as a legitimate competitor to anything remotely official, so why just stop at Vanilla Platinum? Despite being notoriously behind previous generations, the DS games are slowly starting to catch up in terms of how customizable they are. There's already plenty of ways to fix Sinnoh's slow game speed, strange balancing decisions, wild Pokémon diversity, or general quality of life. All things that are completely up in the air at the moment at the time of this video's recording. With the tools for Sinnoh getting better and better, the gap between fans and ICLA's offerings widen every day. Just last month, the community found a way to implement the entirety of Generation 5 by expanding the Pokédex, which is something this game doesn't intend to offer given their very specific wording. I'm not advocating you pirate a copy of Platinum in order to play these changes, since backing up your games legally will provide you with the exact same options. There's a lot of people in this community that think they can do a better job than Game Freak, but these people aren't even intending to do that. I'm saying that whether ICLA likes it or not, they're competing for the definitive version of these games, and it's up to you as to which output looks more appealing. This isn't something that applied to Let's Go or the Hoenn remakes either, since they weren't trying to compete with Gen 3 or Fire Red ROM hacks as to what the definitive version of Hoenn or Kanto was. The scope of their vision was completely different to anything a fan had ever done before on the original hardware. And even if you didn't like how those games turned out, it's clear that the official Sinnoh remakes, intentionally trying to be so close to the originals, have put ICLA and Game Freak in a very complicated position. Granted, there's a lot of stuff in this trailer that still looks promising. Again, I don't hate how this game's turning out, don't get me wrong. What I can say for certain is that I love how they're factoring in Mount Coronet as this looming figure in the background of every battle in Sinnoh. You literally cannot ignore its presence regardless of where you're at in the game, and I think that that's pretty sweet given how prominent it's going to be in your adventure. Some parts of the overworld design in general are also spot on, like the statue in Eterna City being this mixed interpretation of what the box legends might have looked like to the people of Sinnoh, or how you can see into certain buildings which you couldn't do before. There are a few of the big considerations you'd have to keep in mind when bringing the games into 3D, and ironically are the things that go against what this remake is truly trying to aim for. Of course, I've yet to talk about the 2-foot-tall elephant in the room, and as you can probably imagine, I'm not too fond of the art style for these games. See, much like the intent behind why these remakes existed, there was a specific purpose to the art style of the originals. Simply put, that's all they could do within the constraints of their broader style for the series. Up until Gen 7, the lines started to blur between overworld and in-battle, and that abstraction started to fade away. Generations 1 through 6 looked the way they did because the hardware limited each sprite or model so severely. That's not to say that the games couldn't have looked better than they did in the hardware, but it's so abundantly clear that the chibi art style was a product of its time. If you want any more evidence of that, go and play literally any of the older generations pre-Sun and Moon and look at how different the sprites or models appear in battle as opposed to the overworld. Shit, Sun and Moon themselves had different models for both cutscenes and the main gameplay. Like they didn't even have the horsepower for realizing their art style as recent as the end of the 3DS era. Let's Go and Sword and Shield were where that changed, and over the last few years we've had games that laid a consistent groundwork for the style of the series that wasn't bound by the restrictions of the hardware. Even if Let's Go had a slightly different art style to Sun and Moon or Sword and Shield, it was still in service of the vision that game was trying to go for. Going back to a chibi art style for the Sinnoh remakes throws away so much progress in that regard. Being intentionally faithful to the originals is one thing, but now it's being done for the sake of being faithful, and not in service to the intended vision of what Sinnoh was supposed to be. We don't need a chibi art style anymore because we literally do not need it. This isn't even me complaining that the graphics are too low quality, it's that they didn't need to go the extra mile to make it look like the abstraction they were going for on the DS. It looking the same as it did in 2007 is not the compliment you think it is. Especially when this is the game about a super serious villain that wants to reset the entire universe in his image. It is so needlessly regressive in spite of all the advancements we've made over time. This is like if Cloud's model looked like this in the FF7 remake. It's just like the original, so that means it's a perfect remake, right? No. Stupid. I'm not saying that the Sinnoh remakes need to look like a PS4 game, but it's clear that the vision for a game like FF7R was that it's how they would have wanted the game to have looked back when they were making it, and not an idealized version of what you remember playing when you were much, much younger. I think the worst thing about all of this is that the Sinnoh remakes aren't even consistent with their own regressive art style, because instead of having an aesthetic that the game fully commits to throughout its entire runtime, it jumps back and forth between it and a far more realistically proportioned style with every single battle. This was never really a problem before because as fans of the series we didn't know any better. But after games like Sun and Moon or Sword and Shield, the growth that we've had since the days of needing these abstractions leads to such a rational disconnect. And I'm getting tonal whiplash with every fucking random encounter because they wanted the games to look identical to the originals for the most arbitrary reason. It's like if Link's Awakening just did a 180 every time you entered a house. Also, the people comparing both of these games confuse me so much because it's blatantly obvious that they aren't trying to do the same thing at all. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl exist as a celebratory return to Sinnoh that aims to keep everything as similar to the original as possible. Whereas Link's Awakening tried a style that was completely disconnected from the original, particularly in terms of tone. It also doesn't help that that game front-loaded quality of life updates, like more button remapping and warp points, the color dungeon from the DX version, and a whole new minigame. I can say that the impact to the tone as a result of the updated visual style wasn't what I expected when it came to a Link's Awakening remake, but it was an intentional attempt to do something different regardless of what the eventual quality or response was. Gen 4's remakes clearly have different priorities, and it's such a bizarre comparison even when removing any personal feelings. In a vacuum, the chibi art style is whatever, but a whole game designed around that could have been really cool, where it's more of a stylistic change pushed by the intent for a different tone versus the weird overly faithful look that we got. Likewise, a game entirely in the style of Sun and Moon or Let's Go also has its benefits, and would make Sinnoh appear far more well realized than we've ever seen it before. My biggest issue behind the intent of the art style is that it can speak volumes about their approach to the rest of the game's development. Aiming to recreate something in a different game style that uses full 3D assets and adds a ton of new features? Now that's a creative risk. Remaking a game entirely in 3D and using it as the basis for an experimental style of gameplay? I'd say that's also a creative risk. What about remaking a game to look like a diorama that is completely dejected from the style and tone that the original was trying to convey? Surprise, surprise, but that's very much a creative risk. Sinnoh Remakes going back to a chibi art style for the sake of being faithful? Sounds like there's very little risk involved there at all, and I'm worried that this could have a trickle-down effect on characters, lore, mechanics, and overall gameplay. As they appear right now, the Sinnoh remakes are not a creative risk. But that's only frustrating to me because Sinnoh itself was such a creative risk.
This is most disturbing.
Take a look at the context of the series at the time. After Ruby and Sapphire proved that Pokémon could still succeed without the need for Pokémania or any sort of pull for nostalgia, they released Fire Red and Leaf Green, which is absolutely the safest game they could have made for purely getting a new audience back into the first games. I can imagine the success of those games left the series in such a dilemma when it came to making whatever the next generation would be. Do we make a sequel to Hoenn in a similar vein to Gold and Silver, or go with something completely different? That decision-making could potentially jeopardize a brand that had such a split identity issue, one that was either fueled by nostalgia or completely new reinvention. Sinnoh, of course, chose the far riskier option. Another huge consideration during Gen 4's development was the fact that so many people were getting into playing video games just because of how widespread and accessible the DS was as a system. How do you even begin to design, in their words, the ultimate Pokémon game that caters to a newer group of people on top of a growing audience of 10 plus years? Furthermore, you got Pokémon that people had already fallen in love with that got redesigns in the form of new evolutions for the very first time, which again is such a massive creative risk. This wasn't like Gen 2 or 3 where they designed baby versions of existing Pokémon, but instead they were full evolutions, essentially intended to be upgrades to Pokémon that people had grown up with. It's far more risky to design something that for all intents and purposes was supposed to supplant the original from a gameplay perspective. The wider scope of the series was also seriously cracked out during this time period. They had to design games built entirely around using dual screens for the very first time, and integrating Wi-Fi connectivity within most of Gen 4's features no doubt ballooned the game's scale into absurdity. Spending a chunk of your game's development towards online functionality that you have no idea if people are going to use is yet another huge creative risk, and I'll always have massive respect for those that made the GTS and online battles possible in the first place. Whilst it was hardly a direct sequel, the game took elements that were introduced in Ruby and Sapphire and now made them larger than life. Hoenn had secret bases, while now Sinnoh has a whole fucking area, mini-games, and several new Pokemon dedicated to that initial spark of an idea. Damn, Gen 3 had a lot of legendary Pokemon, right? How about even more than that? Last game we dealt with a cataclysmic story that would have destroyed the world, but this time we're dealing with the mythology of the entire universe, the birth of human emotion, and the creation of literal continents.
I don't understand what's going on here.
I'm not saying these remakes have got to reinvent the wheel like the original Diamond and Pearl did, but not doing anything new or creatively risky is the antithesis of what Sinnoh was. And as I've shown before, remakes can bring something new to the table instead of being intentionally regressive. In all honesty, I'd even argue that they're not living up to the style that they're trying to imitate. Like putting the original game next to the remake doesn't even look favorable to the one with 15 years of hindsight. I hate to come off as nitpicky, but on the DS this exact scene feels far more wondrous and expensive than the new one because of just the camera angle. Now you can see the complete right side edge of the lake, which makes it appear far smaller than it looked in the original. Again, I really hope that this doesn't come off as nitpicky, but this sort of thing really matters to me when the goal of your remake is to make it look just as good and just as faithful as the original, right? Even with just the pictures we have right now, it's super inconsistent. Sinnoh looks way darker than it should in a lot of areas, even factoring in the day-night cycle. And the battle intro being a one-to-one recreation, blank blue screen included, means that we lose the far more cohesive transitions that even X and Y had. I don't want to pass judgment on the style as a whole, but I'm pretty adamant about it being kinda unnecessary at the very least. Look, I'm typically the one that's super optimistic about Pokémon as a series, and to an extent, I still am. I've got a whole nother video planned on Legends, and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are still going to be a lot of fun, since at worst, they're just going to be like the games I loved as a kid. But what really kinda hurts is that we're not even getting a traditional Sinnoh remake to begin with. Even if there's compatibility with Home or Sword and Shield, it feels just as isolated as Let's Go did from the main series, which feels so wrong. I want to be able to take my bros from Unova to Sinnoh just cause, and not this weird 493 sandbox that's identical to what it was back in the day for such arbitrary reasons. Call it my nostalgia, I don't really care, but it feels shitty that Sinnoh is almost like a guinea pig for Game Freak's experimentation for the series going forward, which no main generation remake has ever felt like until this point. Also, don't call people ungrateful for saying that they're not happy with it. I'm sure that when people ask for a Sinnoh remake, they at least envision something far more traditional like Fire Red or Omega Ruby, which is hardly an unreasonable expectation. Regardless of what you think of the remakes or Legends in terms of quality, it really feels like we're getting two halves of a traditional Sinnoh remake. And bottom line, I don't want to have to wait another 15 years for them to get that chance. Thank you for all the support on my recent videos. You can head over to my Patreon to see both new and a wealth of behind the scenes content much easier.